Let's first look at the email you are most likely to have already seen. I have seen this being discussed by several people already. In an exchange between two people who work for Jeffrey Epstein, one of them here mentions that Epstein told him that he had lived in the Vatican with Pope John Paul II. Now, this is a strange story. According to this person, Epstein has claimed that the Vatican has a collection of different columns from countries that they conquered. In any case, this cannot be completely accurate because the Vatican hasn't conquered anything. Maybe there's a hint of truth behind this. That maybe a few churches in Rome contain columns made from rock that came from places that the ancient Romans conquered, or something along those lines. But as this story is told here, it makes not that much sense. This, of course, calls into question as well the claim of Epstein living in the Vatican. Maybe this person is just full of shit. Or maybe it was Epstein who made up a bullshit story, who knows. So when I see Roman Catholic apologists dismiss this source as not credible, I think that is relatively fair. However, there are more references made to John Paul II that are harder to brush aside. The internet is a big place, so maybe they have been discussed elsewhere, but I have only seen people talk about this one email, which is why I decided to make this video looking at the other mentions as well. Another reference to Pope John Paul II appears in an email exchange between Ghislaine Maxwell and Philip Levine. Now, this Philip Levine fellow is actually not the poet you might be thinking of, but actually an associate of Bill Clinton, who happens to have the same name. After Levine has presumably sent a picture of himself and Bill Clinton, many of the attachments of these emails seem not to have been preserved or are perhaps in another place, he writes, "I need to become close with the Pope next." And Maxwell responds with, "As much as I love the pictures of you and Bill, I will trade you. Picture of me and the Pope for the picture of Bill and his newspaper cutting." Now, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, we don't have these pictures that they're talking about. It's hard to imagine an innocent reason for why these pictures are apparently worth treating like some kind of commodity. I feel like by far the most intuitive explanation is that these are incriminating pictures intended to be used as blackmail in some way. More emails actually follow this, but they switch to talking about different topics that seem less relevant. I found another email making reference again to a presumably problematic picture of the Pope. Here we have even less information because the date is corrupted, obviously it doesn't actually come from the future, and the sender is censored. It seems sometimes to be almost completely random whether people's names are being censored. But it is logical that this would once again be Ghislaine Maxwell, and it's fairly likely also that it is sent either shortly before or soon after the other exchange. I think the phrase "me and the Pope cozying together" is very suggestive, and while it maybe leaves some doubt as to the nature of this image, it also takes away a lot of doubt. Personally, I am more or less convinced that this picture in question is something we would rather prefer it not to be, something very indecent and compromising. The Pope makes another appearance in an FBI report where a witness claims that Epstein claimed that an elevator ceiling was a gift from the Pope. Now, it's hard to imagine that this is literally true. It makes little sense to give someone a ceiling as a gift. It's absurdly random. And yet, it's very concerning that this does mean that we have two completely separate, unrelated instances of people claiming that in some way Epstein's home decoration was Vatican-inspired. This does not necessarily mean that it's automatically true that Epstein has indeed stayed in the Vatican for an extended period, but it does make the claim sound a lot more plausible, since it does prove that Epstein does have some kind of emotional connection to the Vatican. A few other mentions of John Paul II are mentions of that picture we probably all know. This picture has been making the rounds for longer, but I do think it has been recontextualized slightly. Firstly, we now know that he didn't just have this picture, he also had it displayed somewhere, suggesting that it means something to him. Like, I do not have pictures in my house of random people I met on a single occasion. Secondly, we now know that this is in fact not the first time, not the only time they met with the Pope, since that picture is from their audience with the Pope in 2003, and Maxwell mentions her and the Pope together as early as 2001. I do believe there is a level of ambiguity here still. We don't know how close Epstein and John Paul II have been. It may not have been a particularly close relationship, but I think it's intellectually dishonest to continue to believe that there wasn't a meaningful connection at all. I think we need to regard it as an actual fact that Pope John Paul II was involved with Epstein. He was absolutely way less involved than, for example, Donald Trump. But he was definitely involved with Epstein in some way. I know that this is an extremely sensitive topic, since he's likely not only the most popular Pope of living memory, but also a canonized saint. Like, people have a devotion to this man. I understand very well that many people will be unable to accept that John Paul II was, not nearly as holy as he had managed to convince the people that he was. You must also understand that I'm not saying that these mentions prove that Pope John Paul II truly did any horrible things. Again, we do not know what the nature of the relationship between him and Epstein was. What I'm saying is that these mentions give serious reasons for doubt. Since secular authorities seem to do almost nothing at all with the Epstein files, I hope at least the people in the Vatican wake up to these facts and commission a new investigation into the life of Pope John Paul II. The Epstein files give some good leads. There are quite a few people in the Epstein files who could reasonably be expected to be able to tell us more about the nature of the relationship between John Paul II and Epstein. If these new revelations, however, do not bring the Vatican to start a new investigation, I must unfortunately conclude that the corruption reaches far. I implore you all to conclude likewise.